So it is my privilege and an honor for all of us in this room to welcome you as our keynote speaker and hear your ideas on alleviating hunger on this planet. Senator George McGovern, thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Romano. It's always a pleasure for me to come to Milwaukee, a city that I have long admired and whose votes I've appreciated. But also, there's another reason. This is a city that is the residence of one of the most lovable and admirable women in this entire country, Susan McGovern. With the help of her husband, Jim Rowan, I happen to know that she has worked tirelessly for months to make this conference the great success that it is. And that's a major reason why I'm pleased to be here. I don't quite know why each time I have come here at Susan's invitation, she has put me in a church. We had the Unitarians last time, and now the Lutherans. I've been debating whether it's because she thinks I'm a holy man or because she thinks I'm so deep in sin that I need the redemption of the church. I read some time ago that Lutheranism may not save you from sin, but it will take the fun out of it. I passed that bit of wisdom on to one of my Lutheran friends the other day, and he said, well, I've heard that you Methodists are never going to be fully satisfied until you make sure that nobody else is having a good time. I think more seriously, it's appropriate to meet in a church because today we're talking about what is one of the clearly most deeply moral challenges of our time, which is the continuing problem of hunger and poverty across so much of the world. If I were going to pick a text for my remarks today, which my father would do if he were here, I would go to the Gospel of Matthew, where Jesus is saying, I was hungry and you gave me food. I was thirsty and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger and you welcomed me. I was naked and you gave me clothing. I was sick and you took care of me. I was in prison and you visited me. Then the people will answer him, Lord, when was it that we saw you hungry and gave you food, or thirsty and gave you something to drink? And when was it that we saw you a stranger and welcomed you, or naked and gave you clothing? And when was it that we saw you sick or in prison and visited you? And the Lord will answer them, truly I tell you, just as you did it to one of the least of these who were members of our family, you did it to me. There's a long theological debate that's gone on in this country and elsewhere about which is more important, faith in God or good works to our fellow creatures. And even the Bible raises the question, how can ye love God whom ye have not seen, if you love not your neighbor whom you have seen? Well, being a politician, I'm going to tell you that both sides are right. It's important to have faith in some kind of force greater than ourselves, perhaps a spirit that moves at times within all of us, but it's also important to remember that faith without works is dead and of little effect. Today I'd like to ask you to think about just one aspect of the poverty problem. I fully endorse the millennial goals to make poverty history. That's a gigantic task, but one that is within our reach, especially if we will heed the words of Zanab Salbi, who spoke here this morning, that you only have a realistic hope of ending poverty if you can somehow curb the destruction and waste and the devastation of war. I remember as a bomber pilot in the Second World War, coming back at the end of that war, I had flown a full string of 35 combat missions over some of the most heavily defended targets in Europe, oil refineries, tank factories, aircraft factories, and so on. And I was bringing back to the States my own crew, plus 16 meteorologists who were bound for the South Pacific, since it was expected the war in Japan would continue. Obviously, we were happy to be free from war, and on the way home there was some sadness when we realized that half of the bomber crews we flew with never survived the war. But by and large, that night, after we climbed up above the clouds, it was a beautiful moonlit night in the month of June, and you could see those white clouds below, and then up above was the moon and the stars. And I thought, what a wonderful thing. We finally have ended this tragic war. We have the United Nations in peace, and they're pledged to keep the peace of the world. And it's going to be great to go back home to a world that is at peace. But shortly after we arrived at home, the Cold War began. Perhaps our major military ally in making that victory possible, the Soviet Union on the one side, and the United States on the other, obviously the two most powerful countries ever established on this planet, but they were soon at each other's throats, not in open warfare, but in what was called the Cold War. It was a Cold War, but it was hot enough to get us involved in major conflicts, and for 50 years to consume half of the federal budget of both the Soviet Union and the United States, and perhaps more fundamentally, with these two giants at each other's throats and holding the world in a nuclear peril that with one false move on either side could have set off a conflagration that might have destroyed all life on this planet. And one of the things it destroyed was the possibility of unity in the United Nations. Some wits threw out a crack one day, the most impossible task is to unite the United Nations. And that was largely because its two most powerful members were using their substance, their resources, and their know-how to pile up the biggest arms race in all the history of this world. President Eisenhower, a five-star general who understood something about war, perhaps more than most of our presidents, was conducting a meeting of the National Security Council in April of 1960. That was his last year in office. And the Secretary of Defense, what we used to call the Secretary of War, he was making the argument that we needed to build more intercontinental ballistic missiles. And Eisenhower said, look, we've already got several hundred of those things. That's enough to kill every Russian a dozen times over. Why do we need more? And the Secretary of Defense said, well, that's right, Mr. President, but this is a matter of perception. If the Russians perceive that we're easing off on the production of nuclear weapons, they may assume we're going soft and would be tempted to hit us. Well, in a moment of disgust, President Eisenhower said, well, if there's anything to that argument, why don't we build 10,000 of the damn things and be done with it? He meant to dismiss the argument with that argumentation. I just dumped a glass of water on the floor, so if I start sounding hoarse, somebody come up and help me.
There's somewhere.
Okay. He said, you heard the comment that Eisenhower made, why don't we just build 10,000 of the damn thing? Well, that's precisely what we did. We built 11,000, and the Russians did their best to keep pace with us. And it's one of the major reasons why we have this problem of poverty and hunger persisting to this day. We placed enough pressure on the budgets not only of Russia and the United States, but other countries out across Europe and elsewhere who also were spending hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars on the weapons of war. And unfortunately, that process goes on. I think it was Mr. Romano who reminded us the Senate approved yesterday a military budget of $455 billion for the military, partly to carry on this needless and unnecessary war in Iraq. What I would like to do is ask us to just think for a few minutes about one aspect of this problem of poverty and need, and that's the problem of hunger. I recognize that sanitary water, the presence of it, the availability of it is just as important, in some respects more so. The problem of AIDS is one that cries out for solution. But perhaps if we take one problem that we can get our arms around, we can begin to see real progress there. The world has committed itself to cut chronic hunger in half by the year 2015. That's 10 years from now. When I arrived in Rome to take over the job as U.S. ambassador to the two agencies on food and agriculture there of the United Nations, they had just completed that conference, I think maybe 2 years before I arrived. When I asked them how much progress had been made in taking 400 million people off the hunger rolls, there was a sort of an embarrassed silence. And then the chairman of the meeting said, well, the truth of the matter is we've added another 20 million people to that figure. Here we are now in 2005, almost a decade after that summit of '96, and instead of 800 million people on the hunger rolls, we have about 850 million. Now, if you want to take 400 million people off the hunger rolls in the next 10 years, you've got to do it at the rate of 40 million a year. That is not an insoluble task. And here's a couple of ways we might do that. Number one, I would like to see the United States take the lead at the United Nations in providing a good, nutritious school lunch every day for every hungry school child in the world. That's about 300 million kids of school age that now trudge off to school in the morning with a makeshift breakfast and get nothing to eat until they return late in the afternoon. Of that 300 million, 120 million have dropped out of school or never started, mostly girls, because of the favoritism towards us males in most societies. Even though I've thought for many years the females are the stronger of the sex. But these youngsters, of course, are the future in these developing countries. Once you start a school lunch program, three interesting things happen. Number one, the enrollment jumps dramatically. Nobody, no matter how expert they are in foreign aid or in development, has discovered a better magnet to pull children into school than the promise of a decent meal once a day. The girls come to school. The parents suddenly discover that if they can just get their children up in the morning and get them to school, they'll get a good meal. That not only means more sustenance and vigor and strength for the child, but it means more food is available at home for those who don't go to school. The mothers might even be allowed to eat if there is a little more food available. The second thing that happens is that academic performance jumps dramatically. And every teacher in this room would understand that. It's hard to educate anybody who's sitting there suffering the pangs of hunger. Now, the third thing that happens is something I'd ask you to remember. I have people tell me, you know, George, I agree with you, we need to feed the hungry, but we're never going to get on top of that problem until we start controlling population growth. We're just producing people faster than we can feed them. Well, here's what happens when children go to school, even if it's just for 6 years, 1 through 6. Whereas these little girls who stay at home, illiterate, unable to sign their names, unable to read a book, start getting married at the age of 10, 11, 12 years of age and have an average of 6 children, according to United Nations studies. Those that go to school for at least 6 years, postpone marriage, they have a better sense of what life is all about. They see some of the alternative paths that might be available to them. They're not as easy for boys and men to push around. They have an average of 2.9 children. So you slightly more than cut in half the birth rate on the power of education that is expanded through the use of the school lunch program. We can also teach children at school to plant a garden around the school building to produce fruits and vegetables that aren't so easy for the members of the United Nations to export to those countries. And it can also be a reward for their own farmers. So I think this is something we ought to get behind. When I conceived of this idea in Rome a few years ago, I called Bob Dole and asked him if he would agree to support a concept like that. He asked a few questions, good Republican questions, and then told me that he would be delighted to serve. And so he's been with us on this in the beginning. We now have school lunch programs of this kind operating in 38 developing countries, not full-scale nationwide programs, but large pilot programs big enough to evaluate the impact. And we've written a little book, Bob Dole and I, with the help of Dr. Don Messer, who is a very well-informed man in these areas, that I'm going to be signing later on today, called Ending Hunger Now. And in that book, we spell out a way to achieve this goal of cutting at least half of the people on that roll of 800 million hungry people off the hunger rolls. Now, I've talked about 300 million. You can get another 150 million by working through the United Nations, again, I hope with the United States in the lead, to establish another American feeding program, and that's the WIC program, Women, Infants, Children. It's a marvelous program that Bob Dole and I sponsored in the Senate that went through the Congress some years ago that provides for low-income pregnant and nursing women and their infants through the age of 5 supplemental nutritional packages. They can be sent home to the family through the school children, or they can be distributed in other ways. And that's another way to reach 150 million people that are desperately poor across the world. And then you have a total of 450 million. Now, there's no reason under the sun why we can't do that as a people. I'm not talking about the United States alone. I'm talking about the countries of the world getting together at the United Nations. Some other countries have already come forward to match what the United States is doing. We got former President Bill Clinton to put $300 million into this program to get it started. President Bush provided another $200 million, so the first $500 million has already gone in. With $5 or $6 billion a year from the world as a whole, we could achieve this goal that I'm talking about here today. Incidentally, that's about what it costs to run the war in Iraq for 1 week. So that gives you, we have 2 crises in this country at the present time, both of them Gulf crises, the Gulf of Mexico from this hurricane that has done so much damage, and the Persian Gulf where we're involved. Somehow the juxtaposition of those 2 catastrophes have had a profound effect on the American people. I don't quite know how this works, but I have detected a change in attitudes in this country under the impact of those 2 events. We're told, for example, and I don't want to get too partisan here today, but we're told that the president, who had 51% approval on Election Day a few months ago, is now down to about 38. And I suspect the growing disaffection over this war in Iraq and the shock to Americans of seeing their fellow citizens clinging to rooftops sometimes for 4 or 5 days with no help. I went down to Houston the weekend after that catastrophe, and I spent a half a day in the Astrodome talking to some of the thousands of refugees from New Orleans who were there. The first man I talked to was a young father, had 4 or 5 children. and his wife there. And I asked him, why didn't you leave when the mayor announced that everybody should evacuate New Orleans? He said, well, sir, I don't have a car. I had $6, and I don't get paid for another 2 weeks. And I had 5 children, and a wife, and my mother. And I didn't know how to get out of town. And if I had gotten out, I didn't know where to go. We didn't have money for a motel or a hotel. We don't have any nearby relatives. And that was the story I heard over and over again. No evacuation plan. The levees, which had been reported by the Army engineers to be inadequate 3 years ago, were not repaired because of the budget squeeze. And so tens of thousands of people were marooned in that city under the most miserable and frightful conditions. I guess what I'm saying here is that we can't afford to be sending our young men off to fight in faraway lands where there's no need for their presence, and in fact, where their continued occupation is the thing that has stirred up this insurgency that makes it impossible for the Iraqis to organize a reliable and stable government. I talked to one of our Middle East experts here the other day, William Pohl, and he said, we keep talking about we have to stay in Iraq until stability returns. He said, the truth of the matter is we have to get out of Iraq before stability can return. And so, just one final thought here today. We are living in this country under the fear, if not an obsession, with terrorism, just as we lived for 50 years with an obsession about the fear of communism. I wonder how many of our leaders are asking themselves this question: what motivates this anger against the United States? We think we're the greatest country in the world. At least I've always thought that as an American. Why do these people, why are they willing to, a young man, to strap a bomb around his waist and set it off in a downtown market just to kill other people? Why would 19 young men from Saudi Arabia and Egypt hijack 4 of our airliners and fly them into the side of a building knowing that they would be the first ones to die? I think we have to ask ourselves those questions. This is not to say we sympathize with terror, but simply to try to understand what drives this hatred and suicidal attitudes towards this great country of ours. I raise that question because I think America does have a great deal of good. I think we do have a great deal of generosity. I think we do have a generous supply of decency, and I would like to see it harnessed, as this conference attempts to do, to making poverty history and making sure that in the near term, no child will have to cry her or himself to sleep because of hunger. That's been a message of mine for as long as I can remember, and I stand on it today. Thank you ever so much.
Thank you, Senator McGovern, for continuing to provide leadership and for saying some things that either former or current major politicians are reluctant to say. So we thank you for continuing to speak up and to give us ideas on alleviating world hunger. Simple things we can do.